I invite the panelists to come and join me as well. And just to introduce myself, if you don't know me, The Financer is a blog, thefinancer.com, that writes about FinTech every single day. And some people like it, so I'd recommend you check it out if you haven't seen it already. I'm also a non-executive director of the FinTech consulting group 11FS, who are here in force today, and you might want to engage with those guys as well. Introducing our panel members, to begin with, Keith Saxton is the chairman of the Financial Services and Payments Programs in Tech UK, which is the trade body that represents the UK technology industry. Anne Bowden is the founder and chief executive of Starling Bank, a new fintech challenger bank that's launching very soon. And last but not least is Rush Taggart, who's the chief security officer at Card Connect, which is a payments gateway that's been awarded several patents for security. And our theme is around APIs, and it kind of builds on the last panel. In the last panel, you had several bingo buzzwords. If you didn't spot them, marketplaces, platforms, open banking are definitely three that stood out for me. And it's interesting, because I blogged 8 years ago about the idea of open banking, banking as a service, and said that as a consumer, I should be able to just download apps that give me the best functionality for a specific piece of financial transaction processing, such as a payment, or such as foreign exchange, or saving and borrowing. And I can build my own bank, basically, using lots of APIs and apps. And 8 years later, we haven't got it. But that's what the idea of marketplaces and platforms is, that you can have an open platform, an open-sourced financial industry, where the customer builds their own financial structures rather than being given just a completely integrated end-to-end structure from a bank. Now, because it hasn't happened, the regulators, as we just heard from Germany and from Dan and the panel before, are forcing it into the industry to say that banks have to open up and allow interoperability between different players in their marketplaces using APIs. And I guess to begin with, I'd like each panel member to say a little bit around why has it been such a challenge to get the marketplace to open up? You know, that we're, after 8 years, only just now talking about open banking. And in particular, the role of APIs in that process. So Keith, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So look, let's put a couple of truisms on the table. So API technology is not new. Of course, it's been around a number of years. It's evolved as a pretty mature technology. Go to anyone, they can explain quite well a framework around which an API should be written, how it would work, how it would interoperate. Clearly, the devil's in the detail on that, but it's really engaged, I think, a lot of other industries. You'd recognize it from your own personal use, but government has been particularly active, I think, in various areas opening up data. So APIs have been a bit of an accelerator in terms of facilitating some big data programs and capabilities. And what this really means is that, Chris has already mentioned this, so the interoperability becomes actually the really vital thing we've got to drive rather than APIs for API's sake. That you can articulate a use of API technology actually even internally within an organization when we think about heritage and legacy systems and stranded data in silos, to create sort of local micro clouds, write APIs to get that stranded data out, reassemble your existing systems. And I believe that's a more modern way forward than a rip and replace, big bang for the buck core system replacement. Now, in terms of open banking, if you look at financial services, you know, standards comes into play. And of course, there's a lynch mob outside for anybody who recommends we need new standards. But actually, there are plenty of existing standards that work perfectly well right across the entire financial services industry, be that retail, be it insurance, be it capital markets, or what have you. So you can think of standard industry behaviors. You know, we talk about ontologies. We talk around data schemas and all the rest of it. We can talk about standard infrastructure at the technical layer, which is sort of the transport layer, and lots of financial languages sort of come in alongside technology languages. The piece in the middle, we've got standard reporting, which works, you know, various ways of doing standard regulatory reporting. We've got standard behaviors as well, which would come through agreed structures. Those of you familiar with BIAN would have an SOA standard, for example, or if you look at FIBO, lots of data standards. You know, and there's a behavioural thing here, right? So we're going to touch on culture, I'm sure, as to why we've not really made too much progress around was quite an insular industry. So to me, there's a sort of a truism, which is technology is not the barrier. This is actually the art of the possible already here. The regulatory imposition starts to really come into play, and that's sort of the stimulus we need perhaps to really get going. That raises another question, and I'll just finish on that point, which one would assume, therefore, we have to start thinking through what the regulator believes is coherent technology regulation. Because if we're right, they're going to be regulating platforms and APIs as opposed to traditional entities, or alongside traditional entities, I would say. So that raises another thing. But certainly I think the lack of progress thus far is largely to do with the insular nature of financial services, because if you look at the ability that other industries have moved rapidly forward in sharing data, the big guys, the big platforms open up their data, obviously. That's how it all works. So I think we're struggling typically in a heavily regulated industry for that openness to come, and I think we're sort of at that tipping point. But the technology to enable that tipping point has been around for a while.
There's a few questions that are in my head around what you just opened with, Keith. But just as an aside, there's an interesting aspect from the Austrian regulator where they now tap into the banks directly for real-time data access. So the banks don't have to do data reporting anymore. The regulator just analyzes what they're doing through APIs directly into their systems, which I think will be a trend we'll see coming through much more.
Indeed.
And you've been around the banking industry for a while, and now you're doing a startup new bank. How do you see the world of APIs?
I think you mentioned 8 years ago you were forecasting the world changing, and nothing sort of has really changed yet. If I could go back to, say, 4 years ago when I was sitting in an incumbent bank, and we had a meeting about open APIs. There was a rumour that somebody in France was doing something and it was working. And were we brave enough to go down this route? We're perhaps brave enough to have a hackathon, but were we brave enough to open up our systems? And we've come a long way in those 4 years. Things in this industry take a long time. For those of us around for PST1, we know how long it took. We know how long it took to get SEPA. I think things always take longer than we think, but I think we will actually get here with PSD2 and open APIs. I think we've got a number of players now in the marketplace whose business models are dependent on this happening. We have a government that's supported it, and we have lots of people in the market trying things out day by day. We have Starling Bank is a bank based on this open API environment. We have a marketplace. We do not believe that you can be an effective challenger, disruptor in the marketplace by just doing the same as the big banks on a smaller scale. We believe in scale, we believe in focus, and what we are doing is building a single product proposition around a current account that does something a bit more than just a current account, but it will sit in the middle of a marketplace of other products that will be totally integrated using APIs. And we're currently at the point of actually trying to make all this work. We're currently at the point of sitting down with our partners, figuring out who does take responsibility, trying to figure out what due diligence do we need to do, what do the contracts look like. So in some respects, we're a little bit further ahead than the Open Banking Initiative in actually trying to regulate and standardize these things, with the sharp end trying to make it work for our sort of pilot partners now. And, you know, the title of this particular presentation is Standardisation. And I must admit that I was never a fan of, you know, in my previous careers in the big banks, I was never the one who wanted to go to the standards committees. I leave that to people that sort of were so patient to get everybody to agree on something. But I did a straw poll this morning. I sort of sent a message out in Slack at Starling Bank this morning saying, I'm going to this panel this morning. The first question is standardisation. You know, how important is it? Do we need to do it? Then I wandered around the office talking to people about it. And the majority of people in the office weren't that concerned. They felt that REST APIs gave us 90% of what we needed. The banking industry itself is everybody knows, that the standard components are an account number and a date, whatever. And the little bit we need to do to pull a rigid standard together, it's probably not worth the effort and it's going to slow things down. And somebody will come to the party with adapters if need be. So the general consensus was that, stop worrying, Anne, and tell these people at the conference we're almost there. Just try and test it out and see what happens.
So the technology gives us the openness. You don't need the standards.
I think we have a lot of standards.
Standard.
We have a lot of technology that enforce the certain ways of doing things. Things have moved on so much in the last, 5-6 years. The rest of the world works in this way. We're just now bringing it into banking. So don't be fearful of it. It'll work.
Rush, as a security guy, I guess you understand the security implications of APIs, and is that something that, again, is something that you developed through being in technology, immersed in the technology?
Well, the U.S. Still has tremendous challenges that you've already faced with card-present security issues, with EMV and all that. So much of our work the last 5 years has been protecting card presence in the absence of EMV. That said, the U.S. is probably a third of the way towards getting to the EMV across the board for card present, which will be a substantial improvement. But talking about the open API issues, clearly permissioning and all of that, who's going to manage the OAuth in the sky is a substantial question in terms of delegating access, consumers delegating access to their accounts across institutions. As far as the standards question, I think Anne's very much right. In our view, HTTP, REST, and JSON have kind of won the API, at least transport wars. SOAP has fallen aside. Various other technologies have fallen aside. So now the argument's going to be about endpoint names and field names, fairly minor matters that I think de facto will get worked out pretty clearly. But I suspect that the threat is still the business model around an open API. If I run a bank and all of a sudden I have no lock-in because my customer can just overnight move to some other bank and my Mint account or my QuickBooks account will work transparently the same way, I would imagine that's quite threatening to numerous retail bank business models. So I suspect that's at least a part of the reason why it hasn't happened quite yet.
Yeah, I think that's the point I wanted to raise, because it's underlying all three opening statements you've made. And Keith, you referenced culture, and you referenced the bank's reaction to open API discussions 4 years ago. And I think I'll start with you, Anne, because you've been immersed on both sides. Is it that the banks are control freaks and they don't want to open up? Or is it that they can't open up because they've got such a legacy spaghetti structure that's behind their organisation that they can't actually deploy the APIs?
I think the banks, the incumbent banks, the traditional banks, are full of very, very clever people trying to do a great job in a very difficult environment. And I think that to get these projects done in these large institutions where there's a huge backlog of work to be done, where there's no tolerance of failure, in organizations that are constantly under criticism from the outside world, you have to be very, very brave to take risks. I often get asked the question about how can Starling Bank build this technology and deliver it, whilst separation of banks and replacing technology in traditional banks takes so long. It's very much that we're dealing with a different problem. We are able to start from scratch with new technology, with no customers that we have to migrate from old systems to new systems. And we can start from scratch building things the way the world's now doing technology. Incumbent banks have to deal with technology problems and a very, very critical environment, which means that it's very difficult to change that culture. And I think that since 2008, 2009, it's got worse. If you're in a traditional bank, and many of these banks are subject to a huge amount of scrutiny, it is very, very difficult to innovate and move forward because the world won't let you.
So, building on that, Keith, I mean, you've got a frisson here between startups like Stripe that can become, you know, billion-dollar businesses overnight based on an API, and the industry that's very slow to change. How do you see that playing out?
So I think the two extremes are probably not a place to go and place your bet. So I see on the one hand, obviously, there's a huge incumbent industry, for want of a better word, significant benefits from that, as well as a degree of frustration on how rapidly we might continue to want to be, you know, a world-leading banking environment. But at the other end, I think it's probably not fair to say that every fintech startup, unfortunately, won't become a big unicorn. So you're really looking at pieces in the middle of that. And I think when you talk about fintech and you talk about the need to modernize, we're sort of, you know, it's probably not unfair to call the incumbent banks. It's a bit like Frankenstein, right? So it's a mishmash of parts. It sort of works. And the fintechs come along and they've got this nice brand new hand, but it's only the hand, right? And the APIs is an interesting sort of thing. So it was once described to me as a bunch of people who are much smarter than I am, but it's really the connection between the brain and the nervous system in any organization. So when you think of that, the need to change the traditional status of banking IT systems is well past the tipping point of being able to recover those old systems. It's also true that to take advantage of any modern technology, you probably have to reprocess. That's a big part of big data. It's not just the data technology, it's part of reprocessing. So in the midst of business model changing, in the midst of technological change, you've got to marry those two issues up to really be able to look at something a bit different than what you've got. The tipping point, unfortunately, for the incumbent banks is that, you know, whatever number you want to put on, they're spending 80% of the budget to keep the lights on. That becomes unsustainable, frankly, over the next 5 years. So at what point do you realize that there are new people coming along? And how do you really get that? The other thing is that we say the banks are technology companies, which they are, but they're not operating at the margins of big technology companies. They're not really having to move as rapidly. So I think you've got this clash of both the marketplace changing mainly because of regulation. So you have a real stress on the business model, real stress on the return on equity in a lot of business areas. You've got actually the same cyclical shift in the technology industry where the technology providers are having to move very rapidly from lock-in proprietary systems, sell to the data center, to something very, very different. That's brought in new providers, new incumbents, and provides actually a very beneficial arrangement for a lot of new companies to sort of grow very rapidly. And those two things are clashing. And there is really no better get out of this than actually having, frankly, a leadership team that understands technology. And I'm afraid to say that that's, in the UK, we are light on that, I would suggest.
That's not just in the UK. There was a report at the end of last year that analysed all of the large banks' leadership teams based on their annual reports and found that 40% had no one in the C-suite with any technology background. A further 37% only had one person. And only 3% of bank CEOs have had any technology exposure in their professional career. That's a big deficit.
Can I say something on that? I think it's not just relevant that senior teams have technology knowledge, but they have up-to-date new tech knowledge. You know, I spent 35 years in this industry, and most of that was in traditional banks, in traditional roles as CIO, COO, or running sort of P&L divisions. It wasn't until I stepped away and spent a year in FinTech and then and realized that the world had changed, that it was possible to piece together organizations by plug and play various services, and it was possible to build technology. We have built our banking system from scratch. When I talk about that to my colleagues from the old world, they are totally amazed, because, you know, migrating, building a core banking system in a big bank, doing the project cost $1 to $2 billion. That's because they're dealing with a different problem, right? In a small organization like ourselves, with new technology starting from scratch, you can do it and you can raise the money to do it. And that change of perspective doesn't come that easily. If I hadn't stepped away from my traditional role and gone into something new and then gone back into the industry, I wouldn't have come to that realization.
Rash, I find it interesting from the US angle because we've got a regulation that's forcing the banks to open up, whilst in the US the banks are closing up, in that there's been an aggregation industry that's risen over the past decade to become very effective with personal financial management tools for consumers, and yet some of the big banks are now saying if you allow screen scraping or your data to be shared with an aggregator, then it's your risk and we won't allow it. So the customer has to own the data. Why is that happening?
Well, on that specific point, I'm not sure. But I know that the Consumer Financial Protection Board has come out strongly in favor of the open API movement and consumers being able to access their data and delegate access to third parties of that data. So I think that it's a battle that's going to play out. Ultimately, I expect the open API approach and access will win. Whether it's shorter or longer, the time frames, the reality is it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's funny because whilst the banks are trying to close up, you're right about the CFPB, but also the Office of the Comptroller has come out and said the same thing. That they have to give the consumer choice, basically.
And some banks have got it. I mean, Citi and Wells have open API projects that you can grab accounts to now. Others, JP Morgan, B of A, noticeably silent. So to Anne's point, the cultures in all of these institutions are so different and so inbred that the innovators just have to bubble up from within to open up each of these institutions.
I'm not going to go there, but I heard that Wells are very good at open bank accounts.
Opening, yes.
I like your reference, Keith, to the nervous system, brain and hand, because when I talk about marketplace banking or open banking, the hand is what shakes the customer. It's the front office. It's the customer user experience. The nervous system, to me, is the APIs in the middle office that connects back office and front office. And the brain is obviously the back office, where it's innovation of product and service. And what's happening with open marketplaces is that apps, APIs, and analytics across those three are really changing the game. The apps is the user experience, the API is that connectivity of the system in an open marketplace to the brains, which are the actual analytics, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence in the back office. And there's quite a few new banks starting up, like Solaris, like Starling, like Fidor. There's also some banks that are changing, like Saxo, into these marketplaces. But it tends to be very niche, small players that can do that. So how will the big players ever get to be in that game?
Well, let me go first and then I can help. So I think the application, not in a technical way, but actually understanding what you need to do. So if I look at BBVA, who very clearly think of themselves as a software company and
led by technologists.
Led by technologists who've bought some extensions. I really don't understand, if I'm honest, why the big banks in this country have not had, a top team in skunkworks for 2 or 3 years building a new bank, which they're ready to go on. I just don't understand that. There's a lot of lessons and clues from the regulator about some of the things you should have done already to completely modernize your technology. Banking separation is one of those. Living wills, rescue resolution plans is another one where you're supposed to understand where all your processes reside and who owns all of that. So I think the change will come from market pressure. And again, as a consumer, I think a lot of the FCA focus in particular is largely on the consumer safety, quite rightly. As a consumer, you're not really bothered, actually, are you? Because most platforms, you don't go and question the technology. But the best technology is hidden. It's the process that's helped you. So I know very well when I go on I bank with NatWest, their app's pretty good. It does everything I need it to do. I happen to know in the background it's not automatically live update. Now, one would hope one day they'll get there. There's a lot of things to do to get there. But I also wonder where the shareholder is. Because the reality is, how do you generate shareholder value and how do you generate a better share price? if all you're trying to do is beat yourself up every year and, you know, say you've just put aside another 5 billion for PPI because you can't understand what went on, it's not a viable place. And I think the shareholders haven't yet sort of forced that change. So I think I've referred to the tipping point a number of times. I think the tipping point has been and gone, quite frankly. But the opportunity for the big incumbent banks I don't hear being discussed is significant opportunities to own my data, right? So in the forward-looking world where I don't give my data away for free, I don't share it with everybody, I want to release specific parts of that data at a specific point in time and then retrieve that. There are new technologies, one could argue we better mention distributed ledger just to be honest, to sort of look at some of the things that go on there. But there are opportunities, and I think I'd like to see some follow-through, because the public side, and we're all saying here, there's some great people in the big banks, so I'm not here as a naysayer on the banking industry at all, but we have to sort of get the momentum behind the new stuff, and the old stuff is going to wither and die. And the true reality is something like cyber is upon us all. That's just, you know, that's just another example of this complicated stuff doesn't go away. So you better start preparing yourself. So I think it's peer group pressure, it's new competition, it's regulatory burden, it's shareholder pressure, it's people within those organisations sort of promoting the change. But it has been slow.
So it's not just the customer, it needs all the stakeholders to start pushing.
That's right, yeah, because the customer can gravitate, right? The customer can pop off down the road and take an app that feeds into this stuff, and largely they've only got so much power, right, at the end of the day. So I think they're a big part of that, but we've been around a number of years looking at social apps and customer apps and all that sort of stuff. So it's a big part, but it's not the only driver, unfortunately.
I get the impression most of the big banks are actually sitting and saying, well, if eventually what we have today is going to wither and die because Starling takes over, we'll just buy Starling.
There is that.
Is that the plan?
I don't think so. I think that if we think that what's really going on within large banks at present, to move towards a marketplace model, you have to be prepared to sell, to support, to let your customers get the best product for themselves. So, you know, would an RBS, a Lloyds, a Barclays allow their customer to easily buy a product from another competitor? What we are doing at Starling is to say that the days of cross-selling and upselling are over. We can offer other people's products on our platform because we don't have those products ourselves. You know, would Barclays offer a Lloyds mortgage? So for the marketplace to succeed, it only can really exist in a very different environment. I think that many of the existing incumbent banks will decide to focus on certain things. Many will continue as they are. But you will have people coming together in ecosystems of financial services providers. We hope to be the centre of one ecosystem around a Starling account. We believe that we can do that because we will be offering customers choice. I don't think the existing incumbent banks are... It's quite difficult for an organisation that has existed for, you know, many hundreds of years to suddenly say, we're not going to try to cross-sell that product. We're going to let the customer choose what's best for him or her. That's a very, very difficult cultural change to make. So in our organisation, we're a bank. We've decided not to be a FinTech that provides an app. We are a bank with a banking licence. We have our own app, and we'll integrate into other products on our service, on our platform. You know, I personally believe that many of the FinTechs, these apps coming to market, will not have a viable revenue model. But the ones that will succeed, that give customers choice, will be here in a few years' time, and the ones that don't give real innovation and disruption will disappear. And you can have that general competitive nature in an environment when you're not actually a bank. But when you're a bank, you have to guarantee customers' deposits, And to be a bank, you need capital behind you. And that's why there are so few real new entrant banks in the retail area, because you do need substantial capital. And it is very hard to raise that capital, even in this very sort of fintech-friendly world.
And it's also difficult when you are, as you say, in a regulated, compliant structure where the biggest fear is cybersecurity. So how do you get cybersecurity into an open marketplace for us?
Well, again, that's where the standards piece will really play an important role. We were discussing earlier who's going to own the permissioning model for open access, open APIs. And most likely it will have to start with the banks until there's some other as recognized and as trusted authority that can provide the delegation model across different institutions that, again, the Mints of the world, QuickBooks of the world, et cetera, aggregation applications can all reference to assemble all of these accounts together. But we were talking about, again, the pace of change and why it's taking so long. I personally think it comes back to, what is the open API business model for the legacy institutions? What's going to drive them to adopt this? Because, sure, there's the regulatory hammer, but typically, I believe this inertia is about, until somebody's going to pay me to do it, why should I, and how can I make it sustainable?
Yeah, and it kind of leads to my final question before opening to the audience questions. So hopefully you've got a few in your heads, but it is the business model and organizational structure that is part of the challenge here. And we touched on culture and the issues. And I think it was typified for me by a podcast I heard of the former Netflix head of cloud, Adrian Moorcroft, talking about how they transitioned from a organizational structure where everything was signed off in a compliance organization into one where it was microservices based. And the microservices architecture, the microservices organization is based around what you would describe as two pizza teams. In other words, all the development teams own a little piece of the applications, and if that team needs more than 2 pizzas for lunch, the team is too big. So make it smaller. Keep it really small teams, agile, quick, lean. And then the difference it made for Netflix is that could allow them to move to the streaming video model and develop really quickly, do updates several times during the day if they needed to. And if, for example, PCI DSS compliance needed to change, before, everything had to change and be signed off. Whereas now it's just one little team that does that over a weekend and it just plugs back into the rest. That's what the open marketplace API models are like.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but a bank doesn't have that. And they reference this in the podcast that in a bank, you never get to that microservices architecture because even though they're trying to do it, they then say, but everything has to be signed off by every team before you plug it back in again, which is why it takes a year for an update to the system.
Absolutely right. So that is an enormous cultural issue. The whole DevOps adoption by the IT teams of these large banks is going to take an extremely long time. So in the meantime, the Chernobyl model, effectively, can you build a casket around the legacy environment that keeps your doors open, that on the perimeter provides this open API external access, isolating the internal systems, because these could be decades before your DDA system or your wire transfer system or your foreign exchange system, your SWIFT interface, et cetera, all get converted to microservices endpoints. Ultimately, I think the industry has shown that to be the endpoint. Getting there is going to take a very long time.
Do you see any big banks that are getting there?
I don't have visibility into what institutions are planning, so I certainly know that some of them are indeed, implementing a gateway model to provide this kind of access. What their plans are internally, I'm sorry, I don't know.
And Keith, do you see any movement?
Yeah, you do in pockets, though. This is the problem. So collectively, we've referenced BBVA, but you can look at. I did read about UBS and wealth management. So they've already spent a lot of money on reprocessing, which goes to my earlier point. That's going to be much easier for them to take advantage of new technologies, having done that engineering work. And I think that's the sort of it's almost the ripe territory for fintechs going forward. Is sort of this middle back office conundrum, which continues to vex everybody from the complexity and the cost. So I think you can look at each and every bank and go in there, but and again, this is public referenced already by Michael Hart at Barclays. So out of the 40-odd fintechs they've supported, they don't have a piece of any of them. They've done lots of proof of concepts. They haven't bought any in. So you can't help feeling, along with all the other proof of concepts we see in the industry on other new technologies in all sorts of areas, that where the rubber hits the road is really, really quite difficult. And this ultimately comes down to, it is regretfully a cultural issue. We have a very closed industry. You know, a lot of us have spent a lot of time since 08, 09 looking at the system and systemic risk and all sorts of stuff, trying to learn from other industries. And other industries are moving apace. And the interesting thing about financial services is that others are already doing much better. And so in terms of putting your money in a wallet, or actually taking advantage of a payment service, or actually services around the edge, which you might call shadow banking, but actually are legitimate, the crossover, so commerce is a big industry. Commerce includes payments. Internet of Things has to rely on the same structural issues that we're all struggling with here. So it is super regulated. Anne's spoken about that. It's not a simple thing. We're, you know, trying not to make this sound like, come on guys, you know, just get on with it. But it's heavily complicated, but it has been for a while. And it's not going to get any simpler, right? But the technologies are there to enable it. 5, 10 years ago, I think we were stuck in this, oh no, I need to do a core system replacement. That's a really career undertaking. I think today there are some different answers, probably.
I think it's a question of size. I think that, you know, I came out of a big international bank, spent a year in FinTech, realised the things that were costing me 30 million were costing 30,000 in those companies because they were so small and could respond very quickly. I took some of those skills into a big bank that had taken a big government bailout, and we had a lot of success. We had a lot of success in transforming the organisation, exposing services into service buses and then redeveloping them to deliver things to customers. That was very successful, but I couldn't take it one step further. I could fix the front book, but never the back book, and the costs were in the back book. And I took the decision to quit and start again. But starting again, it is very, very easy to start when you're 4 people, 5 people building a new bank. But very, very soon you reach 100. And how would you keep that agility? We currently work we're much more of a technology company than a bank. We have majority of our staff are engineers. We have the best technologists from around the world, and we have the best product managers that we're flying in from Silicon Valley. And we're creating teams that are transforming processes and reinventing what customers will actually see. So in a typical group, you'll have engineers, you'll have product designers, you'll have UX specialists, and you may have the CFO in the middle of it all. So this new environment can deliver things that are very, very different. But it is a question of scale. You know, we can do it with 100 people, perhaps 200 people, 300 people. It is very difficult to do it in an organisation where you may have 50,000 people sitting in operations and IT. Yeah. It's a very different problem to solve.
I find it quite funny that we talk about FinTech because it's putting finance on technology, whereas banks talk about tech fin, putting technology on finance, which is the wrong way around, really. Any thoughts or comments or questions based on what we've covered, or are we desperately hungry? Yes, sir. The microphone is coming to you.
Roland Pfeffer from Morgan Stanley. I'd be interested to hear that, I mean, we've talked a lot about legacy infrastructure, and that it's a problem for big institutions, but at the same and that, let's say, fintech companies have the advantage of, let's say, not having that legacy infrastructure. But at the same time, technology moves so fast that in, let's say, I don't know, 3 to 5 years' time, that might already become legacy, right? Let's say thinking about machine learning, thinking about IoT, blockchain, quantum computing, and so on. Now, at the same time, there's a buildup of cash flows, but that cash flow level might not come to a sustainable level where you can kind of invest into new capex. So I'd like to understand how you kind of manage that kind of, let's say, challenge between, on one side, technological innovation that moves fast, and even for some of the new innovators fast, and build up of cash flows to sustain capex.
I've changed my thinking about how you manage investment in technology. In my old world, a project had a budget. You worked on that project, then you capitalized it, and then depreciated it over a number of years. Starling Bank, we assume that the majority of our spend forever is going to be on technology and engineering. And that's how we've structured ourselves. We will have a team of engineers, designers, product people, UX, and they will be there developing and innovating forever. We are not assuming that we're going to build something and then walk away and let it run. In order to keep at the leading edge, of this industry, that's what you have to do. Sometimes I get asked the question, what are you doing in order to prevent creating the new legacy? That's a very, very difficult question. All technologies that we put in place today will become the legacy of tomorrow. Right? It is a fact. Once you have customers, those customers have to be supported on that technology or migrated to something else. So there's no magic bullet here. But one thing you can do is to realize that customers deserve a better product. And the only way you can deliver that is by continuously investing in giving the customers what they really are crying out for. And therefore, don't assume you're going to develop something, put it in and walk away. You have to continuously develop that product in order to meet customer expectations.
Another way to get there is shorten your depreciation cycles. Many applications were built, core DDA, et cetera, with assuming 10, 20, 25-year lifetimes. If those are all of a sudden shortened to 3 to 5 year lifetimes, that can generate the continuous investment that's going to be necessary to keep up with the pace of change that we've talked about. That obviously goes then back to the business model, because that means the short-term hit is that much greater for any of these activities that you choose to take on.
Yeah, I'd sort of articulate banking today as actually an industry with scarce resources. So every bank's got scarce capital, they've got scarce operating budget, they've got scarcity in sort of the ability to spend on things that would be nice to do rather than have to do. And I think this is, I referred to it earlier, we're in this sort of point of time where the technology industry is also changing. So everything as a service is really the expectation. It's really in the design, right? So the data is the fuel by which everybody's going to live by. That's your raw asset, which I think is probably over-articulated in the big data story. But if you've got sort of granular data and agile systems, compute is easy, right? There's no shortage of compute. Think of the internet. It's not when you search, it doesn't go to a couple of servers. It's in the system. And so the design of these sort of big interconnected systems can be internally focused, because naturally there's a internal security issue, but the ability to sort of start looking at things which are non-differentiating, moving to commoditized technology. So I know an awful lot of banks who've built their own technology in the last 20 years, who've taken commoditized technology and done a tiny, tiny little bit of a change on the message bus or the middleware because they wanted to, and they're paying the consequence of that. So going forward, it's the standardization thing. Why not adhere to these standards? Because actually, if you're a technology company and your leverage is not in that underlying compute power, it's in many different things. Different in each sector of the industry, naturally, but I think the business model has shifted, right? So people have got to go figure out how you make money, what capital you put in that. That's a scarce resource. So risk adjusting everything internally you do is a methodology that firms, banks have got to sort of really get over. That's an internal data issue. That's the same as understanding what your customers are doing. And I can't understand why, with all the regulation, people aren't focusing on that. So if I'm the board, I've got to allocate capital in the best way I possibly can. A little bit simpler, I guess, for Anne, because there's a simpler business model to that, very different. But these are complex issues that are not unsurmountable. I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think this is about CapEx or OpEx, but I think there are many things that, as Anne described, your business is technology, which is back to my earlier comment. I think the industry still thinks it's an industry and it's using IT. I'd almost describe it as IT is not really the right phrase. It's sort of a redundant thing. It's a technology-based industry. And once you get into that thinking, then these issues are, they're issues, but they are part of your business. In essence, that's your plan of how you develop that sort of business structure.
I think there's also a critical point that's not being covered yet, which is that we know we're going through a technological revolution in the world right now, and it's been developing for 70 years. The first commercial computer came out in 1946, and in my experience with the banks in particular, but generally with technology, for the first 60 years it was capital intensive and resource intensive. So when you built it, you didn't change it for a long time because you had to write it off and depreciate it. Now it's actually very low cost and very easy because it's on the network, it's open, and it's global. And so if this morning, Ashok Vishwani from Barclays referenced the Aadhaar program in India. That's the digital identity program with a biometric card for 1.2 billion citizens. That is already a redundant system. It's based on a centralized database, which is a flaw because it's one point of attack. And equally, it's on a biometric card rather than on a mobile wallet. So the technology develops all the time. But the difference in the last 10 years is that having done that capital-intensive, resource-intensive rollout like the Indian Aadhaar program, if they were doing it again, it's actually really quick, really easy, and as Anne said, really simple to make it a continuum of change rather than making it a static deployment of something that costs you a lot of time and money. So on that note, I'm seeing the red light flashing up there, which means that we took a long time to answer one question because we like the question. And on that note, I'll hand back to Jeremy.